Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for today's Friday Insight. Here at the museum we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it from civil wars to the present day through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. So today I'm delighted to welcome Sergio Miller. Sergio is a former officer in the Intelligence Corps. For the last 25 years, he has worked in the defence industry and until 3 years ago, continued to serve in the Army Reserve. He's written articles for the British Army Review and the Wavell Room and is the author of a two-part history of the Vietnam War, In Good Faith and No Wider War. Today, he'll be reassessing the British Army's operations in Helmand Province, highlighting aspects of the campaign that went well and exploring what wasn't as successful. There'll be time at the end for questions for Sergio, both for our in-person audience and online. In person, if you just raise your hand, I'll come around with a microphone. Online, you have your Q&A chat feature, so please put your questions in there. Also, for people online, if you're having any technical issues, usually refreshing works wonders. Otherwise, you have your chat feature where a member of staff will be there to help you. With that all said, I'm now going to hand over to Sergio.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me? Okay, thank you for coming along. I put together a presentation with around 76 slides, which is probably too much for an hour. So you'll have to forgive me if I race along from time to time. It's in 3 parts. In the first part, I give an overview of the place and the mission. If you're a veteran in the room, it'll be a refresher. For those of you for whom this is new, hopefully it sets the context. In the second part, I bring out some themes from the campaign, not all good. And then in the third part, I'll finish with things that went well, because both Basra and Helmand are likely to be remembered as misadventures, but in doing that, we pass over that actually good things happened, and we shouldn't forget those. So with that, I will push on. First of all, the place. Afghanistan is a very large country. If you're going to deploy a military mission to a territory that size, numbers are probably going to be an issue. And the reality was then, and is still today, that the only country in the Western Alliance with the numbers was the United States. And the United States took the view, or Washington took the view, that effectively the war was over, when in fact it hadn't really started. It then became embroiled in Iraq. And the Bush presidency took the forced and bold decision to surge in Iraq to save the mission, but his successor, Obama, was reluctant to surge, to increase troop numbers in Afghanistan, which was viewed as a sideshow. And once Osama bin Laden was found and killed, then Washington's focus really was on not on winning it, if they ever seriously thought about that, but on leaving. That affected all the allies, those developments over those years, and it especially affected us because we're such a close partner to the States. We were the only country that supported the initial American Operation Enduring Freedom, November, December 2001, following the September 11th attacks. Then from 2002 to 2005, the British commitment to Afghanistan was basically a battalion-strong force. The majority were based in Kabul, the capital, and then there was a company-sized force up here in Mazar-e-Sharif. It was military tokenism, but then all the ISAF contributing nations, ISAF was the International Security Assistance Force, they were all indulging in military tokenism. Nobody really wanted to be in Afghanistan. Over that period, a plan was agreed to roll out ISAF across the territory of Afghanistan, creating 4 regional commands, north, south, east, and west, and the capital district, which the French took. And we agreed to move to the south alongside the Dutch and the Canadians. And specifically, it was this area here, Regional Command South, Uruzgan Province, which is where the Dutch went, the Canadians went to Kandahar, and we ended up in Helmand. At the time, there was a lot written and speculated of why did a British task force end up in the southwest corner of Afghanistan? But in fact, there was no mystery to it. A Canadian contingent joined the Americans in Kandahar airport in 2002. They remained in place in the succeeding years. So by the time the discussions came in 2005 on who should go where, the Canadians basically felt Kandahar province is ours. We've been there the longest, and we agreed. So we ended up in Helmand province. Helmand province, roughly, from north to south, is the distance from London to Edinburgh. It was only created in the early 1950s, at the same time that land reclamation and canal building projects were started by American engineers, and also the building of the Kajaki Dam, which is this thing here, which is the main feature in Afghanistan. The capital is Lashkargah, which means place of the soldiers. At the time, it didn't exist. Lashkargah was basically a single bazaar and some old 18th century ruins, hence the place of the soldiers. And it owes its existence to an American engineer called Frank Patterson, who decided this would be a good place to build a city. And that's why the center of Lashkargah is the grid pattern, a typical American grid pattern. And that's also the reason why in the adjoining district, where the main land reclamation and canal building projects took place, this area here, Nadi Ali, which means the call of Ali, which is a poem from the Quran, why it also looks a bit like the American Midwest with the grid square pattern. Helmand province is defined by the Helmand River, which runs right down the center from, where are we, Kajaki Dam all the way through. It's the largest river between the Indus and the Nile, but it's an unusual river because it doesn't end up in the sea. It actually turns west and ends up in a marsh area on the Iranian border. Geographically, Helmand basically divides into three parts. The northern part, which runs from Sangin upwards to this mountainous area. There are two main settlements, Nauzad, which means new town. It's a very small settlement. Musakala, which means Moses' place, slightly larger, and then Kajaki Dam. Sangin was, I should say, the center of the narcotics trade. Gereshk in the middle was and remains the commercial capital of Helmand province on Highway 1, which is a ring road that goes all the way around Afghanistan. Lashkargah I've already described, and then Darvishan in the south is the only settlement of any significance in the south. South of Darvishan, there's basically nothing. There's just rocky desert all the way down to the border with Pakistan, the Durand line as it's known, because it was surveyed by a Royal Engineer officer many years ago whose name was Durand. I've highlighted there the governor, Sher Mohammad Akhundzada, because he played an important and unfortunate role in the story of Opherik. When the Taliban regime was collapsed, 4 contenders came up for the post of governor of Helmand province, and he won the competition. Basically, his father, in fact, had been a governor, so had an uncle been a governor of Helmand province. He was from the Alizai tribe, from the Musakala area, respected. He kept the ring with all the vested interests in Helmand, kept the peace. The Americans worked with him well, pragmatically. They were aware of his nefarious activities, but they tolerated them. We came along and decided to dismiss him. The Foreign Office and SIS, MI6, came up with a plan basically to get rid of him. President Karzai was very reluctant to accept this, but he eventually took the advice. Sher Akhundzada ended up as a senator in Parliament, where he was able to bend Karzai's ear and tell him what a terrible job we were doing. Why did we get rid of Akhundzada? Because the Foreign Office and SIS had been given the brief, the counter-narcotics brief. We felt he was getting in our way, or he wouldn't support the programs that we wanted to implement. And so we wanted to put in someone that we thought would be more suited to our interests. If you know your history, in the 1830s, we basically committed the same folly. We got rid of the popular Afghan ruler and we replaced him with someone who we thought would be more susceptible to our interests, and we ended up provoking a rebellion against us. And that's effectively what we did in 2005. His replacement was an English speaker. He wasn't an English speaker, was an English-speaking, tie-wearing individual with a background in international companies. In his first meeting with the Helmand elders at the council, he had to be whisked out because they all turned violently against him. And within 6 months, he was gone. So it was a disaster. Most importantly of all, we got rid of the single person who was keeping the peace in Helmand. In the previous 4 years, where the American troops were based in Helmand, they had suffered just 4 casualties, and 4 fatalities, I should say, and 2 of them in a single incident. The most salient point about Helmand province, or Afghanistan, I should say, is that it was at the center of the opium narcotics trade. At this time, 94% of the global opium poppy crop cultivation was taking place in Afghanistan, and 3/4 of Afghanistan's GDP, which had effectively collapsed anyway because of the Soviet-Afghan war and then the Civil War, 3/4 of Afghan's GDP was accounted for by this illicit trade. The champion province, by a long way, was Helmand, and those of you close enough may be able to read it, but I'll just read it out for you. Helmand province was producing over 5,000 metric tons of opium paste. The next nearest one was Kandahar with 760-odd metric tons. So the epicenter of all this criminality, all these arrows that you see heading off towards the UK, the epicenter of all that criminality was Afghanistan, and the epicenter of the epicenter was Helmand province, where a British government decided to deploy a task force. Helmand is a tribal society. We understood that when we turned up, but we just didn't have the granularity. We didn't understand the different tribes and the tribal dynamics. This slide shows our laydown or our understanding of the tribes in the second half of the campaign. So by this stage, we were only responsible for central Helmand. North was held by the US Marine Corps and also south. And you'll see that it was pretty complex. Some of these tribes were implacably opposed to us and were never going to reconcile with us. For example, these folk here, the Baraksai and the Nurzai, because they were heavily involved in the opium poppy crop cultivation. Other tribes, for example, these folk here, Hazaras, who were viewed as satanic by the Pashtuns, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, they were more favorable to us because they saw us as protectors. Even at this late stage, you'll notice we still hadn't fully mapped out the tribal layout. For example, here we have not knowns, and at the far end of the slide, you'll see also that there are not knowns. But understanding the tribal dynamics was one of the things that it took us a hell of a long time to get, and it was an important part of the campaign. Helmand is defined by the river, Helmand province is defined by the river Helmand, and it's very much like the Nile. Either side of the river, you have the fertile zone, which we named the green zone, and then beyond the green zone, you have the desert, and basically nothing. And that's another view, very scenic. This is the upper Sangin Valley. You can see the beginning of the foothills. And this is a Sangha Sentry's view. Again, we're in the upper Sangin Valley area. This was before being a Sangha Sentry became a very dodgy job, and they had to build more protected Sanghas. Fighting in the green zone. A Worcester and Sherwood Forest soldier put it very well when he pointed out that I came to Helmand thinking that I'd be fighting the desert, and it was more like jungle warfare. And if you were in the green zone, that is a very good analogy. It was close country. Fields of visibility were very limited. Fields of fire were limited. It was good for the insurgents, and it was bad for us. Every 100 meters or so, there were these ditches. You can see these guys here. These are 2 para standing in one. I think those guys in the corner are one of the rifles regiments lying in one. At the height of the growing season, another soldier described it as submarine warfare. And you can see these folk here making their way through a maize crop. It was, as I say, it was good for them, and it was difficult for us. It wasn't just about fighting in the green zone. We also patrolled in settlements. That's Prince Harry in Derbyshire. In the south, that's a butcher's shop in Gereshk. And beyond that, there's that's the main drag in Gereshk, and the equivalent of the Tesco's. And this one up here is one of the main bazaar streets in Nadi Alley. So it gives you an idea of just how backward Helmand province was. The ISAF mission. We were part of a much wider ISAF mission. At its height, there were about 50 contributing countries. However, the important country, and I'll have to read out the figures for you, you won't see them, was the United States. This was 2012, so we're now looking at drawdown. With 90,000 troops. The next biggest contributor was this country with 9,500. The disparity was enormous. And that slide doesn't tell the full story because for the first time in the US Army's history, there were more contractors serving than US Army soldiers. So you really have to double that figure to get a true impression of the commitment, the American commitment. It's closer to 200,000. And then the next biggest group was us with 9,500. It's a sore point. It's raised its head again as a result of the Ukrainian war. Our dependency on the states, without the states, there would not have been an ISAF. And it's still true today. Okay, an overview of Op Herrick. Why were we there? This was a prepared statement read out by then Defense Secretary John Reid. I apologize for the spelling. That should read R-E-I-D, not, I should have corrected that. In January 2006, 3 months before the paratroopers deployed on Op Herrick 4. All those points are worthy ambitions. However, if you pose the question, well, how are you going to do this, and also why, they raise points. For example, why are we trying to build a democratic state in a near-medieval, rural, deeply conservative Pashtun society? Are those bullet points that the Helmandis presented to us, or are those agenda items of British government departments? And the answer is obviously the latter. And we know, in fact, that the Helmand Plan Group, as it was called, didn't actually deploy to Helmand. They went to Kandahar Air Base, and they wrote the so-called Helmand Plan there. They didn't actually interact. To my best knowledge, they didn't interact with Helmandis, who didn't speak English anyway. This is essentially a list of bullet points that Westerners put together and said to the Helmandis, this will be good for you. In 1952, some of you who may know the history, Eisenhower made a famous speech in which he likened the situation in Southeast Asia to falling dominoes. If Vietnam fell, then all the dominoes would fall and all of Southeast Asia would turn communist. That became known as the domino theory, and it underpinned the American commitment to Vietnam. And in fact, if you read all the, they were known as National Action Security Memorandums, the NASMs that the White House promulgated from the Eisenhower presidency through to the Johnson presidency, they all, relating to Vietnam, they all start with an assertion of the domino theory. It's really striking because NASMs were essentially policy documents where the US government said, we are going to do the following, but they all had to start with a justification. Why are we doing the following? And the only why that Washington could come up with was the domino theory. Afghanistan also had its domino theory, and it was a jihadist domino theory, and it was articulated early on by Prime Minister Blair in November at the Lord Mayor's banquet speech. The full transcript of his speech is 4 pages long, but this is the key bit where he says, if chaos and strife get a grip on a region or a country, trouble will soon be exported. In other words, if the domino falls in Afghanistan, then the dominoes will fall all the way back to a street in London. And because of that, we have to take a more active and interventionist role. But was this true? Wasn't it the case that Islamist terrorism, which erupted in this country and was unknown in this country, happened because of this government's, or the British government's, participation in the invasion of Iraq? Wasn't it the case that the terrorists, the Islamist terrorists, were homegrown? They had nothing to do with it, with Afghanistan. Isn't it the case that chaos and strife has always been present in what used to be called the Third World, today is known as the developing world, and that didn't result in the export of violence to this country? And isn't it the case that it was our interventions precisely that were causing the problem? That was never challenged, and it created the mantra, keeping Britain safe from terrorism. Those of you who lived through it may remember. Politicians repeated that. Senior military officers repeated that because the only thing they could hold on to. And yet, 4 years on, after the Taliban have swept back into Kabul, are you or I any less safe because we're no longer there? Obviously, the answer is no. Okay. Op Herrick can be divided into 3 parts. We simply haven't got the time to go through each, all the different Herricks in detail. For the civilians amongst you who don't know, the reason why it's Herrick is because the MOD uses a random name generator, and it just happened to throw up the name of Herrick, who's a 17th century poet. The reason why it starts with Herrick 4 is because there was a Herrick 1, and there was a compressed Herrick 2-3, something that is forgotten. British troops were in Helmand a full 6 months before the controversial Op Herrick 4, which set things off onto badly. A British an infantry company, sappers, engineers, signals, Royal Air Force, they all turned up a full 6 months before to start setting up the infrastructure, the airstrip, Camp Bastion, the headquarters that was going to be built at Lashkar and so on and so forth. That force was not molested. They had no trouble at all. And in fact, there was discussion on how many white minivans we would have to procure to ferry the troops around. I saw the document, and I remember, smiling afterwards in retrospect, given what happened. But that gives you an idea of how peaceful it was and the perception that, that we're not going to have any trouble. However, we did have trouble because of the controversial Op Herrick 4, which we haven't got time to discuss. Those first 5 Herricks stand out because each of the brigade commanders that came in attempted to deal with the insurgency in the light of their own perceptions and their understanding of the problem in Helmand and how to deal with it. And as a consequence, the post-operational reports, the PORs that they wrote, are actually the most interesting for future historians because they expressed their ideas and they thought, this is what's happening. After Op Herrick 8, that stops completely. I don't know whether that is because instruction came from above to stop debating it. But from Op Herrick 8 onwards, the PORs become basically bland technical documents that sin by omission. In other words, you read a paragraph and you think, okay, but so what? Is this good or is it bad? But there's no comment. It becomes neutral. Op Herrick 8, which is Mark Carlton Smith, in his POR, he is the only brigade commander who used the phrase strategic failure. He warned that the mission was heading for strategic failure. He wasn't a seer, and he couldn't have foreseen the end that came in 2021, but it is nonetheless notable that there were 17 brigadiers, I think, in total that passed through Helmand, and only one made that point, as it were, spoke truth to power. The difficult years were Herricks 9 through to 13. They were difficult because we suffered the majority of our casualties over this period and because IEDs proliferated, which we will be looking at. It was also over this period where the US Marine Corps came in and reinforced us, and there was also the change of government from the Brown government to the Cameron government. And then finally, there was the drawdown from Op Herricks 14 through to 18, where the mission changed from trying to take on the insurgency to train the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police for the handover. Was anybody accountable? That top line is not unique to the MOD. You could draw that line for every British government Department of State, really. But it does raise questions for a War Department, the Ministry of Defence. Who was responsible for that war? Was anybody? Was anybody accountable? Should somebody have been sacked? Should somebody have resigned? These are awkward questions to ask in the case of a Ministry of Defence. You could also be rude and put a very similar line for senior officers. And then if you compare that line with the American Defence Secretaries, if you were someone like Robert Gates, who served across 2 administrations and did 5 years as Defence Secretary, what was he making of the Brits? Because he had to deal with 5 British Defence Secretaries. Well, we know something about what the Americans thought of us because of the WikiLeaks, and it wasn't flattering. Okay, who were we fighting and why? When we first turned up to Helmand, we basically had no intelligence. We depended on the Americans. And the Americans, who had been there for the previous 4 years, they told us that there were about a dozen armed groups and the Taliban, not the Taliban and some armed groups. And there was a very specific figure, I think came from CIA reporting, of 400-odd Taliban in the north under a particular individual that the Americans had a bit of an obsession with. And I think the armed groups is why John Reed, when he gave made his announcement about he hoped that we'd spend 3 years there and not fire a shot, he didn't say, but the Taliban may attempt to derail us. He said that we know that there are some groups that may attempt to derail us. And I think he said that because he was being briefed with the same intelligence that I was reading. Who were these armed groups? And how do we reconcile the puzzle that if you go through the shell's worth of documentation that the 8-year campaign generated, all the reports and so on and so forth, what you see is Taliban or TB, the abbreviation. Were they? The answer is we're just never going to know whether they really were Taliban, that is hardcore Taliban trained in Pakistan and so on, or whether we were really just fighting locals who didn't want us to be there. Halfway through the campaign, we noticed that around 70% of the occasions where we were able to recover a body and an elder from a village came to collect that body, that individual that we'd just killed came from a village within 2-kilometer radius of the patrol base where there had been that firefight. In other words, we had basically killed someone from a local village. It couldn't reasonably be the case that in every village there were Taliban and there were not. So the probability is that in the majority of cases, we were basically getting into bun fights with the locals who didn't want us to be there. There were two broad approaches to the insurgency. One was this: can we shoot our way out of this one? And these are the numbers from One Royal Anglian in 2007. They were pretty chuffed with themselves. They had over 350 firefights with somebody. And you can see there the ammunition expenditure, how many bullets they fired off, how many Javelin missiles they fired off. This is an anti-tank missile that they were firing at human beings, 87, each of those costing $76,000 in those days. They called in 154 CAS missions. CAS missions in an airstrike, these aircraft dropping 500-pound bombs in those fields. Was this going to succeed? Well, it wasn't, basically. Why? Because we basically started off a chain of retaliation between us and them, and once you start that, it was going to be very hard to stop it. It was the case that we started off violently, and as Op Herrick proceeded, we gradually began to realize this is just not going anywhere, we need to calm down. But it was never the case that the violence stopped, because once we had started that chain reaction of violence, then it was always going to be difficult to stop. We like to pride ourselves that we weren't like the Americans, that we had a softly approach, but was this true? The numbers suggest that it wasn't, basically. That top line shows you the GMLRS firings. GMLRS was a rocket, a single rocket, very large rocket, went out to 70 kilometers, unerring accuracy. The Americans provided 4 launches to us, and you can see by the end, we had fired off 817 of these missiles. Each, I can't remember the exact cost of them, but they're over $100,000. So we had fired off about $80 million worth of rockets at individuals, at insurgents. Those 4 launches that we had accounted for half of all the GMLRS firings across Afghanistan. So we were the GMLRS enthusiasts in Afghanistan. The bottom line shows another missile. This was the Israeli Spike extended range missile that we procured. We changed the name to Exacta because of the sensitivity of us firing an Israeli missile at Muslims. And again, you can see we only brought it into service in Herrick 10, but you can see by the end of the mission, we had fired off 186 of these missiles. So it was a bit of a self-serving myth on our part that we are subtle and that we follow a softly approach. The reality was we were pretty violent. The other approach was, okay, if we can't shoot our way out of this, can we talk our way out of this? And this is a Shura, the meetings that we held. We held Shuras right from the beginning, and in fact, Ed Butler, the first brigadier, held Shuras in Sangin, which would have been unthinkable towards the end. You'd have been lynched if you tried to do that. And we got good at this. We wrote a doctrine note on it. We held hundreds of these, and as the mission developed, we got better and better at them. But they never quite compensated for the fact that we were also being violent. So on the one hand, we were sitting down with the Afghans and talking to them and saying, what are your problems? How do you think we should resolve this? And on the other hand, we were also still firing and shooting. So the two things contradicted each other, much like happened in Vietnam. Okay, some themes. Soldier weights. If you served in Afghanistan, probably one of the most emotive issues was the soldier weights. A colleague of mine that was working in the defence company where I still work wrote the article for British Army Review in which he pointed out that British Army soldiers were being asked to carry more weight than you can legally load on a seaside donkey. And in fact, they took measurements in the summer of 2008, and soldiers were having to carry between 50 to 60 kilograms of weight on patrol. That had an important consequence, and that was that fire and maneuver, the basic battle drill that everyone is taught when you go through battle school, went out the window. You can't maneuver if you're carrying 50 to 60 kilograms of weight. So it just became fire, and the fire was destructive. Another theme was the austere living. We tend to think of Helmand as the summer fighting, but there was also the winter tours, and the winter in Helmand was miserable. There were flash floods, snow in the higher grounds, and this was one reason, not the only reason, why it was difficult for us to deploy service women in Helmand. The British Army then and today, 11% of the British Army then and today are service women. Just 1% of Task Force Helmand were service women. Not because the Army didn't want to give the service women an opportunity. The Army is absolutely correct in the way it offers opportunities to service women today. It's very different to the Army I joined. But the challenges of sensibly deploying what would be one or two service women in an environment like that, you can see for yourselves, they couldn't be surmounted. Barmaying. Everything in the Army these days is at op this or op that, and the minesweeping that every patrol had to do was known as op Barma, and it gave a verb to the English language, to Barma. That's a Royal Irish patrol, and the guy in the front in Sangin, and the guy in the front is sweeping with a German Wahlen mine detector. Every patrol that stepped out of a patrol base had to minesweep the entire length of their patrol because of the threat of IDs, which I'll cover in a second. You'd think that the guy with the mine detector was the safest role to be, but in fact it was the most dangerous. And a lot of these guys paid the price with their lives or losing legs. In fact, just yesterday I was talking to someone who did 2 tours, and he was telling me how the infantry and the Royal Engineers who deployed rests, they were known as Royal Engineer search teams, used to challenge each other as to who was doing the more dangerous job, the infantry with the Wallens or the rests, who also used Wallens but also used a number of other detectors. And the reality was both were very dangerous jobs and both paid a price. Putting your feet exactly in the footsteps of the guy in front of you also, by the way, was no guarantee of safety. Over the course of the campaign, I read scores of WIS reports, they're known as. WIS is capitals WIS, Weapon Intelligence Section. Every time there was an ID incident, a WIS section had to write a report on that incident. And what really struck me about all those reports was just how capricious this whole business was. A patrol would go out, do everything right by the textbook and get caught out. You'd then read the next report. The patrol was a bit idle and they got away with it. This is what every patrol that went out of a patrol base looked like. We haven't got time to go into the detail of it, but you can see that the amount of kit that they had to carry, the specialist kit, the different weapon types, the different roles that each had to play. You can see at the top, there's the 2 Wahlen men, and here you can see in the picture, there's the Wahlen man. Behind him, I think, is actually the commander. Behind him is one of the interpreters. At the back of the patrol, you'll see there's a spare Wahlen man. And the reason why there's a spare Wahlen man at the back is because if something happened to the 2 front Wahlen men, if they triggered an ID, which happened, you had to have some safe way to get to those 2 guys, because the Taliban stopped laying single IDs, they began laying ID fields. So if you triggered one, you were pretty damn sure there's going to be another one in that vicinity. And soldiers ignored, in rushing to try and help a comrade, they ignored waiting for the Wahlen, the spare Wahlen, and they ended up getting killed or injured. What does an ID look like? They're basically straightforward to make. You need a main charge, this here, which they made from homemade explosives from the fertilizer, which is abundant in Helmand province. That yellow container is the vegetable containers, which are ubiquitous in Helmand. You need a power source, a battery. You need a switch to set the thing off. I'll show a switch in the next slide, how they work. And then you need an initiator, which you put inside the charge. All homemade components, very easy to make, all the components available in Helmand. This was the most common form of switch, the thing that you trigger, that triggers it off. the VOIED, which was a victim-operated IED or pressure plate switch. Basically, it comprised of a plank that you put down. Above that, or just over that plank, you put the metal contacts. And above the metal contacts, you suspended a saw blade. And in this case, you can see it's on 4 springs. That's the saw blade there, and the 4 springs. You buried that just underneath the ground. You laid the earth on top of it. When someone stepped on this, they depressed the saw blade, it made contacts with the metal, and you set off the IED. There was an obvious disadvantage to that, and that is it's metal. So if someone's got a metal detector, the barmer guy at the front, the likelihood is he's going to pick that up. So this is what happened. The low metal content, VOIEDs. The Taliban switched to carbon rods, and it's likely that the Pakistani intelligence services taught them how to make these. Carbon rods you can get from batteries, old batteries, for example. The problem with this is self-evident. All of a sudden, the Vallon man was picking up nothing. And as you can see from the text at the bottom, it says, these devices produce little or no reading on Vallon or other HASD. A HASD was a high assurance search device. They started appearing in Geresh in the summer of 2009, and then they just proliferated. This created a dramatically different picture for patrols going out on the ground, as you can appreciate. All of a sudden, the Vallon man was helpless. So how did they do it? Well, ground sign was one thing. Search dogs, they began to introduce search dogs. You had to find the battery pack, so people the Vallon men got clever at trying to look for the battery pack first, because obviously there's metal in a battery, so they'd detect that. But this changed the situation dramatically and caused us a lot of problems. It was on an industrial scale. This is a Royal Welsh patrol with their 2 Fijians for the rugby team. And you can see they're very pleased with themselves because they've picked up a large haul. But it was on that sort of scale that they were laying these IDs. And to give you an idea of the numbers, there you go. These are months. So at the peak, there's over 900 ID incidents taking place in Afghanistan, in Helmand. Those were incidents in us triggering them, or us finding them, or turn-ins, because a lot of the farmers got fed up with the IDs, and they were telling us where they were. That doesn't reflect the true number of IDs that were being laid, because we were only finding a proportion. We'll never know how many they were being laid, but we can be certain that those bars really should be in the thousands and not in the hundreds. That was the scale of what soldiers and Marines were facing in Helmand. And this gives you an idea of the problem it caused. This is a hotspot map. Basically, the green is where there are fewer IDs, yellow, more IDs, and then red is many IDs. And you can see, and this is center-south, this is Lashkar, the capital, and this is basically the remaining area towards the end of the mission that we were responsible for. And you can see, well, where wasn't there an ID? The black spots, incidentally, are where we had IED incidents. And if we zoom in, there you go. All those black spots are where we had an IED strike. And all the red areas are where there was a British Army base. And you can see what was happening. The British Army base was very quickly being surrounded by IEDs. And if you were a soldier trying to get from, say, this patrol base up to that patrol base, a matter of 3 or 4 kilometers, you knew with certainty that we're going to stumble into IEDs. And you knew it's going to take a day or two because you would have to crawl along carefully obviously to deal with the IEDs. Counter-narcotics. I should mention it because the Blair government volunteered this country as the lead narcotic nation in 2004. This country has no agency with any experience in counter-narcotics. The Foreign Office and SIS, as I've mentioned, MI6, were given a pot of money. From memory, it was £240 million. 2/3 went to the Foreign Office, 1/3 went to SIS. These 2 organizations then felt they had to deliver something. They really couldn't. We had no good plan. It ended up with, as I've mentioned, the governor being dismissed, which was the start of all our problems. And basically nobody had a good idea on how to deal with counter-narcotics. And that includes the Americans, who spent billions, far more than us. The irony of it all is, in 2001, the Taliban came back into power, and you can see what happened. Opium poppy cultivation collapsed. The last time opium poppy cultivation collapsed in Afghanistan was the last time they came into power, in 2001. we could have had, if we had played this in a different way, we could have had these guys on our side and we could have sorted out the counter-narcotics problem. Today, it's almost eradicated now, that the opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan. Those of you who lived through it and can remember, there were a number of sticks that the media used to beat the government with. One of them was the business of protected vehicles. We can't go through the detail of it all. One of the volumes of the Chilcot inquiry deals with this very well. And credit must go to then Defence Secretary Des Brown, because it was he that basically got the army by the scruff of the neck who were procrastinating and said, buy the vehicles you need. And it was also Des Brown who opened the Treasury purse. Gordon Brown was then Prime Minister and made the money available so that we could buy the protected vehicles that we needed. Protected must mean protected. The vehicle on the left, the Jackal, is the British designed and British manufactured Jackal. Along with the Land Rover, it was the only British vehicle in the fleet. More British soldiers and Marines were killed or maimed on the Jackal, this vehicle, than on the Land Rover Snatch. Some of you may remember the media, how they got on top of the Land Rover Snatch story. They completely missed the Jackal story. Why? Because, or why was it such a dangerous vehicle? Because the commander and the driver, as you can see here, there and there, are sitting over the wheel arches. If you drive over an ID and you're sitting over the wheel arches, the consequences are going to be bad. For different reasons, I had cause to go to the mod depot in Ashchurch near Gloucester, where all the casualty vehicles were brought back from Afghanistan for coroner purposes. They were all kept in a big aircraft-sized hangar. I had an opportunity to look at the Jackals and all the other vehicles as well. And you could see clearly what was happening, that it just wasn't a good situation. If you were a commander or driver and they went over an ID, then the consequence is going to be bad for you. This thing is a protected vehicle. That was the US Cougar that we bought, which we renamed the Mastiff. A warrant officer in the Rifles serving in Sangin survived 14 IED strikes in that vehicle. Nobody would have survived 14 IED. They weren't surviving one IED strike on the Jackals. He was asked about this, and he said, well, I never really wanted an office job. As if the choice in life is it's an office job or it's IEDs. But it gives you the difference. Protected must mean protected. The saga of not enough helicopters. Again, if you lived through it, you may remember that the media beat the government with. It wasn't the case that we didn't have enough helicopters. And I'll have to read out the figures for you because you won't be able to see them. But this shows the height, the Joint Aviation Group at the height of our deployments. The helicopter types are at the bottom, and you can see we deployed 10 Apaches, 4 Lynxes, 7 Sea Kings, 5 Merlins, and then 9 Chinooks. The red figures are how many of those aircraft we actually had in the fleet. So we actually have 50 Apaches, we had 100 Lynxes, and so on and so forth. It wasn't the case that this country doesn't have helicopters. We do have helicopters. The problem was treasury caps on flight hours and relentless cuts to the armed forces resulting in limited ground crew. You can only fly as many aircraft as you have ground crew, which is a problem the RAF are experiencing currently with the rollout of the Joint Strike Fighter. That was the reason why we didn't have enough helicopters, not because this country doesn't have enough in their fleets. The saga of not enough troops. Oh, heavens, I'm running out of time already. Okay, this photograph here, this image here, shows you the force that was assembled for Operation Panther's Claw, which is the main British operation of the summer of 2009. This was the force available to British Army Brigadier to conduct, Tim Radford it was, to conduct that operation. And to explain what you're looking at, here we have a squadron of the Light Dragoons and 8 Scimitars. These are the ANA, the Afghan National Army, but they didn't really take part. This is one company of the Mercians in Jackals, and this is one squadron of 2 RTR, the Royal Tank Regiment, in a Singaporean vehicle, an amphibious vehicle that we bought. They weren't combat vehicles, they were basically being used as logistics vehicles. In other words, we were using the Royal Tank Regiment as a logistics unit. If you're from a military background, you will straight away realize this isn't a brigade-sized force. This isn't even a battle group. But these were the only troops available to him to conduct the major operation of that summer. And this is basically what the operation was, just to break it down for you. It started off with the Black Watch conducting a heliborne operation to this drug bazaar at the top. The Black Watch didn't belong to Brigadier Radford. They were a theatre reserve. The Welsh Guards then drove up the length of the Shyamalan Canal, which is about 10 kilometers long from memory, to try and block off around 14 bridges to make sure that the insurgents wouldn't escape. This was the operation that resulted in the death of Colonel Thornlow when the vehicle he was driving in ran over an ID. While all that was happening, then the main force came down here, following a route called the Old Babaji Road. The rate of advance of that main force was slower than the British Army's rate of advance in Normandy against the German enemy, and this was against light opposition because it was just such a weakened force and because of the difficulties of the terrain. Eventually, to get the thing going, to keep the thing moving, 2 more heliborne operations were mounted by the Black Watch here and here. This lot, eventually 3 weeks later, arrived at this point here, exhausted, and then Brigadier Radford ordered the Welsh Guards in Warriors to come down all the way from the north to finish off the job and come down here. This isn't a portrait of an army well-resourced. This is a portrait of an army that was really on its last legs and was being asked to conduct operations at the limits of its manpower. Sangin, some of you will remember. Was it worth it? In the autumn of 2006, 3 Commander Brigade took over from 16 Air Assault Brigade, Herrick 5. The brigade commander, Jerry Thomas, suggested, why don't we get out of Sangin? Let's park ourselves in Ford Operating Base Robinson, just 5 kilometers away from Sangin. We'll be out of the way. We won't aggravate the locals. We're close enough to do something if we need to. That was turned down for political reasons because the Americans were displeased with us. They saw our withdrawal from Musa Qala. The Musa Qala deal, as it was known, as a British defeat, so it was politically unacceptable. We can only speculate what would have happened and how many lives would not have been lost had that sensible advice been taken. This slide shows the last British Army unit that served in Sangin before they handed over to 40 Commando, who then handed over to the US Marine Corps. Those are all the folk that died. And if you wanted to get a better picture of the hit that 3 rifles took, you'd have to add all the amputees and all the other wounded as well. The image on the left shows all the British patrol bases that we had set up. And every 100 meters, there's a British patrol base. We were trying to suffocate them. But was it ever going to succeed? We were in Northern Ireland for 30 years. Did we ever win over the nationalist communities in West Belfast or Londonderry? No, we didn't. Why did anyone think that we were ever going to win over the people living in Sangin, which was at the centre of the drug trade? Incidentally, the US Marine Corps fared no better than us. The first 2 battalions that turned up arrived with too much confidence, overconfidence, I should say, and suffered very heavy casualties. One of those battalions suffered the most casualties of any US Marine Corps battalion in Afghanistan. Robert Gates, the Defense Secretary, was so perturbed by this that he considered pulling the US Marine Corps out of Sangin, which is ironic because that was the very thing that Jerry Thomas back in 2006 had suggested and was unable to do because of American displeasure at us. The incredible vanishing British defence industry. This is going to be too difficult a point, and we're running out of time anyway to explain in detail. But basically, in order to sustain the campaign, we had to buy a lot of kit. There was so much kit that we ended up having to produce a guide of what kit we had. And this is the front page of that guide. It was 116 pages long, 1 page for each bit of kit. Just 18 pages of that guide were British kit, and that included legacy kit like the Tornadoes, a Tornado Fighter, the Lynx, the medium girder bridge, and so on and so forth. The majority of the kit that we had to buy to sustain that campaign was foreign, and in fact, all the images you see there, that's all foreign kit. So what? If this country were embroiled in a major war tomorrow, we would find ourselves in exactly the same position as Ukraine found itself in 2022. And if there's anyone in the audience that works in the defense industry like I do, you'll recognize what I'm saying. We didn't so much take a peace dividend in this country from the 1990s onwards. We have disarmed in this country, which is something that the present government is trying to now rectify, but it's a hell of a long and slow process. What went well? And I've only got 5 minutes to go through this, which is going to be difficult. Okay, we should recognise immediate first aid improved immeasurably. If you had served in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, you carried a yellow card in your top left-hand pocket, which is the rules of engagement. You carried a field dressing in your top right-hand pocket. That field dressing was unchanged since the Second World War. In Helmand, for the first time in the history of the British Army, the medics, the team medics, were given the correct training, the proper training, and the kit to save lives in the so-called Platinum 10 minutes, and they did. The number of amputees that survived is a testament to that. The guy in the picture, I'm pretty sure is a Lance Bombardier. Those of you who are close enough can see he was shot in the neck. You can see the entry wound and the exit wound. I can't explain it, but he basically got away with it. As you can see, he's fine, or as fine as you're going to be if someone has just shot you in the neck. The Mertz and the Bastion Roll 3 Hospital, again, a success story. The Mertz were the medical evacuation response teams, this thing here, back of a Chinook helicopter. Uniquely, amongst all the ISAF nations, we were the only ones that decided to go for the large Chinook helicopter. And Defence Medical Services thought they got it right. It meant you had more people and more life-saving equipment. Bastion Roll 3 Hospital was the default life-saving hospital for everyone in Helmand. And here are some statistics. As you can see, the majority surgery hours were actually dedicated to the civilians, not to the military. And in 3 of those months, February, March, and August, the red bars here, green bars, the detainees. In 3 of those months, we were dedicating more surgery hours to the insurgents than we were to British Army soldiers. In other words, these were folk that we had shot or whatever. We were picking them up, we were giving them first aid, and we were bringing them back to Bastion Hospital. Okay. This slide really should be for politicians to dwell on. Every 6 months, the MOD published the casualty data. I think it was legally obliged to. This is the last set of data, September 2013, before the mission transitioned to the training mission. And the point it makes is that it's not just about the fatalities, it's about the attrition that a force will suffer over an extended campaign. And I will have to read the figures out for you because you probably won't see them. But by this stage, by September 2013, we had suffered 302 VSIs, the very seriously injured. These were the amputees. We had suffered 305 SIs, people who were shot, for example, seriously injured. We had a total of just over 7,000 field hospital admissions, people coming to Bastion Hospital, of which just over 2,000 were wounded in action, and then that's 4,800 were DNBIs, disease and non-battle injuries, which is why I put there not the Crimean War, but because all wars are unreasonable. The majority of your casualties, or the people that you're going to lose, are not necessarily combat injuries. They are people you're going to lose because of disease and non-battlefield injuries. The number of Aeromed flights, as you can see, back to the UK was almost 7,000. A proportion of those didn't come back. They were people that were lost to the commanders. At patrol-based level, this is what it looked like. A primary health care was basically 2 or 3 Defence Medical Service NCOs in one of the patrol bases. And this shows you first tendencies over the course of just one Herrick rotation over 6 months. So we've got 16,000 soldiers turning up in front of one of those NCOs and saying, I'm not feeling so great today. What did that result in? Well, days on light duty, 5,500, and days off duty, completely off duty, 1,400. These were people that were lost to the commanders who weren't going to step out of patrol bases, which puts the pressure on people who were, as it were, soldiering on. This is an interesting set of data. It shows soldiers reporting that they had gastrointestinal problems. If you had runny tummy, you were excused patrolling. You didn't step out of the base. And one set of data obviously stands out here, Sangin. What was so different about the living conditions in Sangin that meant so many soldiers were saying, I've got runny tummy? To my best knowledge, there was no difference between Sangin and all the other patrol bases. But what do we know about Sangin over this period? We're now looking at Herrick's 10, 11, and 12. Well, we know that just under 10% of the task force was based at Sangin over this period, but half our fatalities were being experienced at Sangin. We know that on average, 1 in every 6th patrol was getting embroiled in an IED incident. Those are terrible odds. We know that for the first time, the British Army started experiencing refusals, i.e. soldiers who were refusing to step out of the patrol base. Is that a picture of the medical state of Sangin, or is that a picture of the psychological state of the soldiers by that stage? Headley Court deserves a mention. We hadn't had to do anything like this since the Second World War. It was a charity. It was supported by the charities. Help for Heroes, some of you will remember. We ended up with just over 306 amputees. 1/3 of them were double and triple amputees. And we had our first ever surviving quadruple amputee in the British Army, a young sapper who was working in a Royal Engineer search team. The BRF, the Brigade Recce Force, deserves a special mention. It was a huge success story. The 16 Air Assault Brigades started it off in 2006. 3 Commando Brigade then took it on, and then over successive Herricks, it got better and better. The key to this was precise intelligence. And I'll just show you some of their stats. By the end, they were rivaling the Special Forces group, though they were going for different targets. But you can see there, in Herrick 14, they conducted 49 operations, and they managed to pick up 5,700 kilograms of homemade explosive, 177 pressure plates, those switches that I showed you, and so on and so forth. They were hugely successful. I'm just being given the 5-minute red card, so I'll have to go quickly. I'm on slide 56. They were hugely successful, an important asset to the brigade commander. Our super killer, it should be mentioned, the snipers were very important to us. Millions of rounds were fired off by the task force. We weren't killing millions of Afghans. It was these guys that were causing the problems for the insurgents. 15 PSYOPs group deserve a mention. They were only about a dozen strong, tri-service, reservists, a lot of them, and they had a disproportionate effect on the campaign. One of their success stories was this. They set up a radio station, Radio Tamadoun. They gave out free wind-up radios. They invited mullahs to come and do radio shows. They invited women to come and do radio shows. The first time ever in Helmand's history that women had a voice. It was an example of a success story. Training went well. At the beginning of the mission, you basically did about a month's training. By the end of the mission, it was a year-long training preparation before deploying to Helmand. This is an example of one of the initiatives, Virtual Helmand Province, that was created. I happened to work on this, and you can see there's Virtual Musakala, there's the real minaret at the end of the Bazaar Road, and there's the virtual minaret. We modeled virtual Afghans, the jingly trucks, pickup trucks, Afghan national peace, and so on. So before deploying, you could, as it were, wander around virtual Helmand and get a feel for the place. And we did the same. There's an example for virtual Sangin. Biometrics, the Americans gave us 2 different biometric systems, hugely important because the Afghans didn't realize that in allowing us to enroll them, I take iris prints, fingerprints, swabs, and so on, that they were setting themselves up, because if we then found matches with ID components, for example, we were then able to lift them. As you can see there, by October 11th, we had enrolled almost 70% of the fighting age males in Helmand Province. It was hugely important in the second half of the campaign. It was the Royal Signals what won it. In wars, we tend to focus on the fighting and the fighting units. However, in Helmand, that would be a mistake, and it would be specifically a mistake to ignore the Royal Signals, because they played a key part in the campaign. Okay, this is an impossible slide. Wait a minute, I'll just go back a minute. Okay, this is an impossible slide to read, but it makes its point well. The British Army deployed to Helmand with a radio system called Bowman. It was controversial, and I don't have time to go into it. Wait a minute. Oh heavens! That's the slide I wanted up. But basically, to cut a long story short, all that kit there was what we had to procure on top of Bowman to create a working data network. And this is what it made possible. We basically created, the Royal Signals created a spine of masts that enabled data passage between PBs. And I'm sorry that I'm racing through these now, because I know I'm running out of time. And what that made possible was linking sensors to shooters. The sensors are all these. I'll show you an example in the next slides, so you'll see what I mean. But the sensors were these things like the mast-mounted cameras, LTMR was a radar, SAFPOLS was a shot detection system, Revival was a balloon with a camera, and so on and so forth. Each of the patrol bases now had a range of sensors. They could pick up and detect insurgents. They could then pass on that data to shooters. That's funny. Okay, I see what's happening. Oh, no. Okay, let me go back. All right. This is a real example. A light EW team, electronic warfare team, picked up that two insurgents, Zubia and Mahbub, were preparing to attack an ISAF patrol. They were able to fix them, that is, geolocate them where they were. A reviver balloon was then cued onto them. That's the image you get from the camera of the reviver balloon. The next slide should say, but it doesn't say. Yeah, it does. Yeah, okay. Cody wants, no, it doesn't. I'm seeing something on my screen that you're not seeing on that screen. I don't know why. Okay. A UAV, Predator UAV, was then queued onto them, and positive identification was achieved. You couldn't engage without positive identification. You couldn't just shoot at Afghans. You had to positively identify. PID had to be achieved. PID was established, and they were engaged and killed. That sequence of events happened in 4.5 minutes from a LUT detecting and saying, we think we picked up two of the insurgents, to those two insurgents killed, 4.5 minutes. And that's fantastic. You basically can't get better than that. And that was only possible thanks to that network that I had to race through in the previous slides that the Royal Signal set up. Okay. It wasn't just about the bases. There were also lots of moving aerial ISR assets. ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Again, I apologize that I'm having to race through this. Okay, and what did that make possible? Well, here are some of the numbers from the Special Forces campaign. Just towards the end now, Herrick's 15, 16, and 17. And you can see the number of ops they were mounting, 108, 119, 111. So the Special Forces were going out the door roughly once every 2 days. And although we tend to focus on the EKIAs, enemies, insurgents killed in action, 115, 105, and 91, they were also involved in HRAs, high-risk arrests, you can see here, and jackpots were the insurgent commanders, so the people that we really wanted to get. And it wasn't just about the Special Forces, I'm almost there at the end, it was also about the conventional operations. This was Op Moshtarak, which was the last major conventional operation that we ran. It was preceded by as it says there, a month-long ISR soak. Basically, we got hold of as many assets as we could to just observe the area and try and fix where they were and their numbers. And we managed to identify 3 command points here, here, and here. This area actually was the responsibility of the US Marine Corps. This was our area. And how many insurgents there were in these areas. And Operation Mostrak, actually, the first day proceeded bloodlessly, because having identified where the C2 node, where the command and control node was, these guys were taken out by Special Forces just before the operation launched, which created the conditions for success. Okay, in conclusion, we're almost there, good. So, were we winning it? Towards the end, we began saying, well, hang on, the levels of violence have declined in the green zone. This is success, isn't it? But the reality was that we were just displacing the fighting outside the green zone. This was the last area that we were responsible for, and you can see that evidently the fighting had declined in the green zone, but the fighting just increased outside the green zone. Did we ever win over, did the army or the MOD ever win over the media? I don't think so. I think from start to finish, they always viewed the Helmand mission as a misadventure. What was the answer? What was the answer to that question? The official answer to that question is to keep Britain safe from terrorism. But that would be incomprehensible to that woman or indeed to any other Helmandi. And if we could interview the 150,000 odd folk that served on Operation Herrick, what would they say? I don't know. Is this, in the end, what the story of Op Herrick is? A British government deployed as a lead nation, said it would provide security and development to a province in Afghanistan. By the end, we had been reduced to that size, and we brought neither security nor development to Helmand. The map on the left shows the main areas of revolt against us in the First Anglo-Afghan War after we deposed the popular ruler and replaced him with an unpopular ruler. 150 years later, we repeated the same folly, and this shows where the main areas of fighting were against ISAF. What has changed in 150 years? We got there.